We live in a world where primary threats to violent peace do not come from states. They come from non-state actors and non-state organisations that exist in areas where there is very little sovereign control, and the governments cannot stop them from posing threats to individuals within those areas and individuals of other countries. And as a general principle, we think it is perfectly fine for the threatened countries, in that instance, to assert their own authority and own sovereign right over the enemy combatants within that scenario. And to that extent, we think that the United States should form its own court, a federal court within the United States of America, which can determine whether or not enemy combatants or terrorists exist and whether or not they have breached laws that are actually in fact United States laws. We're happy for it to be their own laws. And we think that that court can assert its authority over them and then go through the process of authorizing targeted attacks. We think those attacks will almost always be drone strikes on terrorist leaders or leaders of organisations that are considered enemies of the United States. We also think that this will actually form a challenge route in the instance that the government or the executive acts without approval of the court. It won't apply retroactively, but we think there will now be illegalities possible of being confirmed by the court. Yes.
So are you creating a death list, or are you actually demanding a judicial oversight over particular actions?
Well, I mean, it's both, right? Like, there's judicial oversight over particular actions, but the consequence of it is that the government goes with their death list to the court and seeks approval. We have 3 points that will come from this. The first is that we think that this form of violence is both legitimate and actually in some instances good. And we think that the sovereign right of the United States exists in these instances. I'm then going to discuss precisely why we think the role of the courts is so valuable and why they're particularly effective in this instance at determining these particular outcomes. All right. So why is it then that we think that this form of attack is important? I've alluded to it already in my introduction. War in the current world is no longer state to state. The primary threats are large terrorist organisations such as Al-Qaeda, large groups such as the Taliban that want to take over particular nations, or from states themselves towards their own civilian populations. And that flows through into the violence that has in fact occurred in recent times, both in terms of wars against Al-Qaeda in places such as Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Taliban in Pakistan, but also in terms of the drone strikes that have actually occurred in areas of the Yemen and in Africa. It also flows into the sort of violence that's occurred in Libya, where you've seen civilian, and in Syria, where you've seen state-on-civilian action. And those people are the ones that have become the enemies of the United States, but also general enemies to peace in the world. What's the consequence of this? One, there are areas in these countries and there are people that have control over themselves that aren't under sovereign control of states. There's actually no legal system governing their actions, and the countries do not have power to actually assert their own sovereign right and their own laws over these people. We say that that applies in particular in the cases of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Pakistan. So no laws exist over these people. But we say that alternatively, in the case where it's places like Libya, where they're committing war crimes against their own people, they don't have a legitimate claim as it is. And I'll take you now.
We agree entirely that this is something that's very necessary for the United States in many circumstances to do. Could you tell us why the involvement of the courts isn't just going to be something that's going to slow down the process and provide some formalised basis which is going to be harmful?
Woohoo! Alright, I'm going to skip most of the rest next to that point then, and I'm going to move on to the situation of the courts and whether or not they're going to be more effective. Alright, so why is it that the courts are actually a good forum to do this? Well, one, slightly changing tack from what I was saying just previously. Nevertheless, drone strikes conducted by the executive have wreaked huge harms in places such as Pakistan and Afghanistan when the executive has ordered singular drone strikes. We say that the military on its own has individually conducted seriously bad orders in terms of the drone strikes being conducted. They often resulted in civilian death, they resulted in the overuse of drone strikes in particular instances. And in parts of Pakistan, you actually have people terrorised by the sound of drones buzzing over their heads as a consequence of the fact that they know they have killed their family members and people that they know. But we see that is a consequence of overstretched action by the executive orders of government. And we think that means they've gone, in some instances, simply too far. Why is the court different to this? We say that, firstly, The court is a good forum in which to adequately determine whether or not someone can actually has breached the law. We don't think that's necessarily the big problem in these instances. The thing that the court can do additionally to this, though, is actually set out the specifics upon which these drone strikes are being conducted, like the way in which they will be conducted and the methodology that will be adopted. We think that that means that they can have particular control. We don't think there's an issue in this instance of like it actually hampering the military, the use of military in this instance. Al-Qaeda doesn't have much access to court documents, so it doesn't really have the capacity to prevent these sorts of things from occurring. It means that what you get is maybe, yes, a form of delay in terms of the judicial proceeding that goes on, but we say that actually, given that the methodology of the war being conducted isn't totally immediate, right? It's not in the sense that these people are posing pressing immediate issues to the United States. They are, of course, in other countries. What is actually being determined in this instance is a protracted war and an attempt to break down and defeat an opposition organisation. If you can do that through targeted killings over a period of time, that means that you will over time win the war. We think that's the important outcome of this in the end, given that you actually also exist in a current forum where these particular organisations are existing, are actually on the back foot at the moment, right? There hasn't been a terrorist attack on American soil for a long time. It means that you're likely to determine it in a legal way. And also in a way that doesn't necessarily compromise the safety and happiness of people that exist in those countries. There's also going to be important recourse when it fails, in the sense, recourse when you get problems with executive action. So if they were to order particular drone strikes, that means that there's actually a form of recourse. So like, even if the executive, under our model, determined that there was a drone strike that it could conduct, right, and it really had to do it in the instant case, it's not that they can't do it under our system, but if they do, civilians in those countries have recourse in United States courts against the United States government to actually have a say and bring that system to justice and get something out of it. It means that system is actually better, and it means that the United States can make decisions that actually seek forms of recourse. We think that that is incredibly important, and you get a better outcome as a consequence of that. So as an outcome of this, we think that firstly you're going to see drone strikes occurring in a way that a sovereign right being asserted in the right way. But on top of this, you're going to see the right drone strikes being made because you're getting the proper discussion occurring in a court-based proceeding. You're going to see them being conducted in a proper method because they're being, the court has supervisory jurisdiction, but finally, the executive has to do things wrongly, they can do it in the right way. For all these reasons, we're trying to oppose.
Thank you very much. Good to go. Marvellous. Well, both sides seem very excited, so without any further ado, first up.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Speaker, what we've had proposed by opening government is a model that says that the US court should be legitimate in overriding the sovereignty and authority of countries like Pakistan. Ultimately, we think this is something where a formalised process is likely to lead to even more harmful narratives contrary to the US and even make it far harder to target these terrorists. I'm going to bring you two arguments in this speech as to why federal courts are bad when involved in this process. Firstly, I'm going to look at the delay caused and why that is so harmful in these situations. And secondly, I'm going to talk about the harms of a formalised process. Just to make our position clear in case the point of information wasn't enough. We support the status quo where there are targeted killing of individuals on the basis of military operations without the involvement of the court. We think, as opening government said, these are very important. It's important that we take out Mulin Nazir in northern Waziristan. We think it's important that we support finder operations in Pakistan, in Yemen, and in Afghanistan. And we think that it's like the problem with the legal process is that it does provide some legitimacy to this, which gives impression-based problems to those other countries. Before we move on to those arguments, however, I want to make 3 points of rebuttal.
Sure.
Firstly, as regards their first argument, that attacks are important. As I've established, we agree entirely with their first argument. Secondly, we were told that drone strikes were harmful. Now, this was in like a dramatic rhetorical shift from the previous point where they were talking about how necessary they are. I just think, just as a strategic decision, it's a bad idea to put those bits of material next to each other when we can see how obviously intention they are. But like, he then went on to say is that they're not an immediate threat to the United States, but recognise that they are an immediate threat within local communities such as in Yemen, where the Yemeni government actually wants us there. Once again, material we got from opening government that undermines their own case, which is making our rebuttal far easier. Secondly, note that there is some time variance as regards the harmfulness of drone strikes. We think in general the US now has a far better understanding of the manner of backlash of civilians against these drone strikes, and a far better way of dealing with the sort of the collateral damage and dealing with the minimisation effect and looking into that trade-off. We think that now that's better understood, this is going to be minimised in the future, but furthermore, a lot of the fear is going to be left lingering from that, and so we don't really think that people are going to get much more scared under our side of the house. We think that ultimately we're there. They also told us that the methodology was important in some way, but methodology is the thing that a judge is going to know the least about. They're going to know about pressing need, they're going to know about lawful, unlawful death. They're not going to know much about whether the methodology is effective or ineffective. That's probably something they're going to have to rely on expert evidence from and be not particularly good at adjudicating. Their last argument was that this would provide them with some recourse. Note firstly that there's recourse under the status quo. Unlawful death suits, if you're just killing people, that is unlawful death. Actually, what we think is far more likely is that when you've got a court saying it's okay, and you're then going to another court and saying, can I have money because of what that court said was alright to do, we think that it's very likely that courts are going to show reasonable deference to each other. Judges tend to have some degree of mutual respect. And so they're likely to say no, and they're likely to only provide damages where the thing that they've done is so obviously abhorrent that no reasonable court could have come to that decision. Any British lawyers will have enjoyed the invocation of Wednesbury unreasonableness. No thanks. On to my first argument. Why is a federal court bad? Due to time and sensitivity. We think these decisions have to be made quickly and in a split second. The manner in which we were told was that there'd be a kill list, but then you'd have to go for approval, ultimately. You'd have to go and ask somebody, is it okay if we go and make this attack in some of the northwest provinces of Pakistan, in Khyber, for example? And we think that, ultimately, that's going to provide us with some delay. Inevitably, you're going to have to ask about the circumstances of this targeting, and you're going to slow things down. Now, this is extremely important. These missions are highly time-dependent. The information is normally extremely time-dependent. It often comes from surveillance drones or from informants where, I'll take you in a minute, where people are able to view somebody. But more importantly, these people often move very quickly. They move over porous borders. They move in places where it's very difficult to track them. And lastly, they're just tempted to hide from drones. As they said, you can hear drones in the sky and they tend to move when you hear them. If you see a surveillance drone has seen you, you're not going to hang around for long while courts sit down and say, right then, what's this chap done and how are we attacking him? And how many villages are nearby? We just think you're going to get out of there far more quickly. Ultimately, this is going to mean we can't get anyone effectively. Courts are going to be too slow to do this.
Okay, so do you really think we're going to be trying to get the terrorists who are literally about to bomb someone, or only ever the leaders who are the central of the organisation that you're finding a protracted war against?
Oh, look, we think it's likely that you're going to be prioritising your attacks towards leaders. But we think in areas such as Yemen, where there is so much government involvement, we think it's plausible that you could have some where an attack is imminent. Not necessarily going to occur in the next 5 minutes, but where they've made most of the materials for an attack, for an example. On to the second argument about why involving the courts regularises this process. Ultimately, we think that the way in which we do this now, sometimes, it marks as an extreme due to its extrajudicial nature. When we make it a judicial nature, we delineate it as a non-exceptional act, and a non-exceptional act according to the perception of the countries who we are operating within. It may be that they feel currently that this is an unauthorised act, and it's therefore something that's a little less problematic. But the comparative and how that changes is you now see formalised court action. You now see that the US courts are saying, it's okay, US military, it's perfectly okay for you to intervene with Pakistani sovereignty, to go into their airspace and to do what you like. We think then you can establish a very clear link between a very clear depiction of the US as a political entity and exactly what it is that they're doing. I'll take Leslie.
Okay, but if we have protections showing that we actually do care about Pakistani lives and civilians that could be lost in this process, isn't that actually showing Pakistan that we value their civilians?
I think it's far more likely that there's going to be a prevailing narrative of this being intrusive and trampling upon the sovereignty of Pakistan. I think this is going to play into existing narratives around the US's involvement in Pakistan and the way in which that's demonised. And we think that ultimately, when you're going to say we're doing this by law, we're ultimately going to find that there's some legitimacy being provided by the US entirely. This is going to have a few consequences. Firstly, we think it's going to make it harder for the US to operate in these places. So, at the moment, in Pakistan, when Zardari says he's happy for the US to do targeted... can't say that he's happy for the US to do targeted killings because of just how unpopular it is. Status quo, when they're not approved by courts, there's some reasonable deniability. Firstly from the US government, and they can say that it's just a branch of the military, but more importantly from Pakistan, who can say it doesn't know about a formalised process of doing this, and just thinks it's the occasional attack. When it is a formalised process, when everyone knows the courts are involved, Pakistan have no way of saying, I'm not involved in this, this isn't me. And ultimately what they then have to do is either deny US entry very explicitly and like aggressively, leading to like these necessary killings on OG's case not being taken place, or alternatively, they have to just like admit that their sovereignty is being trampled with all the resultant harms that's going to come about. But also, the US is able to claim that this is isolated, that maybe it's military mistakes or it's just tied to, say, an Obama policy. When it's a formalised policy through the courts, it's far then easier then to attach that to a long-term perception of the United States, rather than an individualised perception of a person. And it's therefore far harder to deconstruct that narrative over the long term when you say this is something your government is involved in. Ultimately, this means we don't kill the people who the opening government tells us it's necessary to kill, and we increase resentment due to the formalisation of the process. I'm happy to stand in positions.
Thank you very much. Prop 2.
This is not going well. Obviously we'll start now.
Just give me a moment.
Really? That's not a problem.
Whenever you're ready.
Drone strikes are incredibly destructive and can be very dangerous. They can strike down without a word and kill someone out of the blue. Drone strikes are also a necessary part of modern warfare against those people who are not directly tied to a sovereign and not directly involved in anything that resembles a conventional war. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not a contradiction we've brought you in today's debate. We say here we have a dangerous but necessary tool, and in the situation where we have a dangerous but necessary tool, we're quite happy to say we take those we trust the most to make the kind of decisions about the use and application of that tool. And that's the case that we brought you from opening government. I'm going to talk to you about three broad things. I'm going to talk to you firstly about why the courts are an effective method of organising these drone strikes. I'm then going to look a little bit at this issue of sovereignty, and secondly this issue of perception, because the two do actually tie together, whatever they'd like you to believe, on the opposition side of the house. Okay, so why then do we think the courts are an effective way of using this new weapon of war? And the first thing, just to get clear here, is that we have seen misconduct with these weapons. We've seen misconduct from the United States military. And why is that? That's because they're doing something that they are poorly designed to do. They're not issuing fights on a sovereign. They're not working within a transparent system. And they're not acting necessarily in a way that's most effective at carrying out the goals of that government. The very, very simple reason for this is that one of the big differences between the drone strikes and normal military action is you can use a drone strike on someone who's not fighting you. In fact, they're most effective when they're used on someone who will be a threat, but is not directly involved in conflict. And that's not something we traditionally, nor should we, give the military the ability to do. That is something that is being considered an extrajudicial killing. We'd like to put it within that judicial system. We'd like to make sure that that killing is handled by the courts. And we think that's going to be the most effective way of controlling that dangerous tool. That's the case you've already. Sure.
Can you explain what criteria the court is using when assessing the legitimacy of a target and legitimacy of an operation?
So, misconception here, right? So the courts are not going to be running military operations and organising the exact nature of this drone strike. What the courts can do, however, is they can set down parameters of who we think are a sufficient threat that we're happy to kill them when they're not directly acting against them. We think the courts are going to be very effective at doing that. And secondly, at what degree of additional damage are we happy to say is worth removing this individual? So the courts don't have to be an Operation X, and when the military plane flies over his head and goes, I spotted him down there, quickly take it to the court so we can strike him down. That's clearly ridiculous. But before that operation takes place, the courts can establish a list of individuals who the US government believes are a threat and are happy to strike down, and determine what degree of force can be used to strike those individuals down, and then action can be taken. And we'd say that this brings two broad advantages. So firstly, we'd say that there's an extra degree of transparency in the courts, especially afterwards. We say that appeals process in the courts an effective way of making sure the right decisions are made. And secondly, what we'd say is it's good to hold someone to account for something that's so serious. Because these are serious, and we don't think it's okay for the executive branch of government to issue these at whim when we can't hold them accountable to them. We're quite happy to say that the courts are going to be able to hold those in government acting under particular pressures accountable. So to the extent that they want to spin this yarn about time dependency, it's quite clear that you can decide what you're going to do before the action has to be taken to do it. We're quite happy to say that we can authorize these strikes before they occur. I'll take one from closing.
So traditionally, the people who are capable of making these types of assessments are not judges, but are military experts.
Yeah.
So the last time we tried this with FISA courts, the court just approved almost all the warrants because when the military said we need it, the court said, okay, fine. Why will this be different?
Right. So courts can get things called expert witnesses to talk to courts. What are courts good at? Courts are good at weighing up evidence and situations, right? So courts can hear expert witnesses from the military. They can also hear expert witnesses who are opposed to drone strikes. They can also hear from people who consider the consequences of drone strikes, and also hear from diplomats who discuss what the effects are going to be. Courts can then weigh that multitude of opinion that doesn't exist within the military. It's only the military you'd be allowed to do under your model. That's why we'd say the court's an effective mechanism of doing it. Right. Let's have a look at this perception of courts and the sovereignty. Okay. So this sovereignty point is important, right? And why is this about the sovereignty of these people so important? It's because these people do not belong to a sovereign nation. So these people have divorced themselves or usurped and evaded that nation. So the people that are running around the Taliban in Pakistan have moved outside the sovereignty of Pakistan. All it requires is a shift in logic to say that having stepped outside this sovereignty, we're happy to say that the person that you are threatening has an ability to punish you for their actions. And then we're quite happy to say that the US, when threatened by them, can do this. Why does this point still matter in the debate? Well, this point matters because that is the explanation that can be given to foreign governments. And that's the precedent that we're setting in terms of the sovereign breaches. So for all they want to harp on about Pakistan complaining about sovereignty, we are not breaching their sovereignty. These people have moved outside and are uncontrolled by their sovereignty. We're happy to say that on this side of the house. But let's have a look at this perception of the courts, right? So this is really the only sort of substantive attack left from the opposition side, which is, but if we pretend that these necessary functional drone strikes are, just exceptional, and we never really use them, despite the fact they're a necessary part of war, then it'll be all right. And people know that the US isn't really, doing drone strikes. So the first question here is obviously, are these drone strikes exceptional? And no, they're not, right? Because they are a necessary part of the functioning of modern warfare. And that means, and Obama has authorized these drone strikes, and it's widely known that Obama does authorize these drone strikes. What does that mean? That means all their analysis about, they don't really think the US government supports drone strikes. It's not official US policy judgment. It's completely wrong, right? It is official policy of the President of the United States to authorize these drone strikes. And given that's the policy of the executive branch, we're quite happy to put the extra cushion by putting that into the court, into the branch of the court. Now, in terms of the sovereignty trampling, okay, so this is the last one. So the idea here is Pakistan can back out of all these deals. They say, but we didn't expect the US to do this, we didn't really authorize the drone strike to occur, we're not happy with this. Well, firstly, they're perfectly capable of doing that even under our model, right? So they can still complain about the US marching over their sovereignty, and that's what they may do. But we allow them an additional out by getting this new conception of what that sovereignty is. And by moving it out of military action, striking down and killing individuals who are not involved in direct warfare, and into a legal action within a court, we actually further that from a normal breach of sovereignty. So no longer will it be the military trampling of the sovereignty, it will be an extension of sovereignty to protect the citizens of the United States. We're happy to say on this side of the house that drone strikes are dangerous. And given they are dangerous, we want to check and balance an effective way of administering. Proud to propose.
Thank you very much. You right? Okay, up to.
I just want to make one point about the legality first. This might make drone strikes legal under US law. This certainly does not make drone strikes legal under international law. It still does not allow targeted killing using almost any other legal system. The reason why that matters is when they want to shift perceptions of what the United States is like or the way they're trampling on sovereignty, it often becomes an awful lot worse when you have the stated policy of the United States that they are regularizing something which is illegal using almost any other moral code. That is incredibly damaging to the United States and its reputation. Let's talk about a couple of things in my speech. First, I want to talk about briefly about any kind of recompense which currently exists. And secondly, I want to look at courts and what they do. And finally, I want to look at the United States and the way it appears. By and large, dealing with points we'll hear from the previous speaker. But the first thing I just want to point out is the way in which the military currently carries out drone strikes. Because I do think there's a huge misconception. 2005, 2006, you do have the horror stories where the United States was attacking wedding parties. By and large, and almost exclusively, that no longer happens. How do we know that? Something we call COIN, counter-operational insurgency tactics, which you've seen from betrayers onwards, and the idea that when you use drone strikes in ways which are not considered to be conducive to your military operation, that often is counterproductive, because it doesn't just lead to deaths, it leads to resentment in the population and more terrorists being created. That thus means the United States and the military of the United States often polices itself to a large degree, and we think it's hugely beneficial, so we don't get these egregious abuses that side of the house once claims happens. Why is this particularly important? Well, now let's look at the arguments which they make and the claims they make. The first is that this is the only case where individuals who are harmed can get recompense. In the first place, currently under the status quo, plenty of people, at least a small group of people, who've been harmed by drone strikes or had their families destroyed, have had recompense. They're able to sue the United States under alien tort laws. This has happened, for instance, after the Farah City attacks in 2010, where you had plenty of the victims, or at least groups representing some of those victims who weren't terrorists or associated with terrorists, suing the United States. That happens on either side of the house, and indeed, as James tells you, is more likely on the our side of the house, because you don't simply have deference to other courts. Their second claim is, you won't necessarily get all these attacks. So this simply is reducible to their claim then that courts will work well. Several things on this. One, so their claims are twofold. One, the courts would decide who the targets would be. How could they make this decision? Presumably the only way they make this decision is when a few members of the military give factual claims about what those individuals do or who those individuals are. I'm not sure what the alternative expert witnesses would be in these cases. It's instead just a finding of fact by the military. This is incredibly important when you then realize that in the vast majority of circumstances, all that's going to happen is the courts will say, well, that's fine because we can't really adjudicate on where you got those facts from particularly well. We'll simply trust you because you're the military has more knowledge overall. So the second claim is then, well, maybe you're going to have more information about the methodology individuals use. We already point out on both teams from the opposition that by and large courts aren't in a great position to work out what the right methodology is or what the right operations are. But I'm also a little bit vague about what this would mean. Are they saying that the courts will decide that you can allow 12 civilians to be killed but not 14? I think that's an incredibly implausible claim of what the courts would allow. More importantly though, the only way the courts can ever make those decisions is yet again by an understanding of who that individual is. I.e., if it's Osama bin Laden, you're probably willing to accept more collateral damage. Again, all that is a finding of fact or a factual claim by the military, which is then determining the decision by the courts. You by and large then don't change military strategy at all or military action at all. You simply legitimize in a way which is incredibly harmful. Top off.
Do you think, though, that it's good that a court can set parameters on the strike, like saying you cannot bomb that town because that will kill civilians?
So I actually think that's entirely neutral, by and large, because I don't think the US military would do it anyway. I really demand that they give you a reason why the US military would attack a town where you don't have a high-value suspect. Not only because I, by and large, don't think militaries want to kill large numbers of people, but because of the kinds of resentment that's being created. That's a point about betrayers, that's a point about counterinsurgency operations. So what then is that side of the house are left with? They make a few arguments about sovereignty. So let's just talk about sovereignty, the perception of the United States. They first say this isn't actually a violation of sovereignty because in a case like Pakistan, the federally administered tribal areas are already outside the control of the state. In the first place, that doesn't deal with James's arguments, which were about the perception of sovereignty rather than sovereignty itself. But even on a simple factual claim, I'm unclear why, for instance, Abbottabad, an area about 20 miles outside of Islamabad in Pakistan, isn't Pakistani sovereign territory. I really don't see why that argument fits. So they're left with a handful of arguments about what exactly this does to the United States and the perception of the United States. So here are a couple of things I want to point out. In the first place, I think it's incredibly beneficial that you can have some level of plausible deniability. So look at the status quo in Pakistan, arguments James made, but I don't think they fully understood. The first thing I want to point out is someone like Zardari is incredibly reluctant to give full backing to US operations because it's politically unpopular, shown to be very clearly after you look at the Pakistani backlash, which occurs after Osama bin Laden is assassinated. So as a result, so he'll never publicly back it. Why is it beneficial then not to have this being the clear and stated policy of US institutions? I do admit to some degree it is very clear the United States does do this, and to some degree Obama has already admitted to doing it. But when you do have complaints about it, these are complaints which are ex post. You say the United States shouldn't have done that particular action. It's very different than when you know who this death list is. You are then going to complain before the fact, making it far more politically costly for the United States to take that intervention and that attack in the first place. And that's incredibly damaging, not just for the United States, but often for people like Zardari himself, who privately will almost certainly want the Pakistani Taliban to be destroyed because they're a threat to him. Secondly, the reputational break which will exist. Note, for instance, there's a huge difference between saying the United States as individuals do this, and the United States as institutions allow you to breach our sovereignty and kill our citizens. So under the status quo, at least it's plausible that you can say that this was just George W. Bush, or this was George W. Bush and Barack Obama, but not the United States overall. What happens now is you simply don't have that opt-out. The Pakistanis who are supportive of the United States, or the Yemenis who are supportive of the United States, can't in 5 years say the United States aren't evil, it's an isolated decisions of a few individuals, and instead they have to say that it is the US because it's legitimized through US institutions. That prevents the kind of break which will allow maybe 10 or 15 years a better feeling on the Arab street to the United States overall. At the end, the fact that you sanction this and you mechanize it and you have to regularize it is harmful. It doesn't lead to the positive benefits. The ideas of recompense they give you, that is of proportionality, are ones which are either existent in the status quo or decisions the court isn't in the position to make decisions on. We're very happy to oppose.
Thank you very much. Prop 3.
Mr. Speaker, I think that actions speak louder than words, in the sense that drone strikes happen literally in Pakistan every week. In the last 5 years, drone strikes have been multiplied by over 6 times any other administration. Pakistan knows that the United States thinks it's a legitimate tactic insofar as they use drone strikes to such a regular degree. I think by creating some sort of control mechanism and being, as the first speaker actually conceded, a little bit more conservative in terms of how you're using drone strikes, it actually gives a way more positive image to that mechanism within times of war. I'm going to give you 2 points of extension. The first one is going to be talking about legitimizing drone strikes by adding protections to it actually makes eliminating terrorism easier because it creates more cooperation. So 2 things into that. First of all, right now, state governments in a lot of the places where we use drone strikes, particularly Pakistan and Yemen, have very little incentive to work with the United States because it's considered a largely racist policy. By which I mean, when the United States takes perfect purview in being able to say, in using drone strikes, that they have to give no evidentiary standard for who constitutes being the victim of a drone strike, and they have to give no standard for what number of civilians are actually allowed to be caught within that drone strike, and they have to give absolutely no evidence standard to any of the public, whether that is the governments of the countries that they're actually using those drone strikes on, or the people themselves to the United States. What that means is that you have governments across the world that don't trust the United States with that intelligence information. What I mean by that is if the Pakistan government found information about terrorists that live in Waziristan, even particular locations or plans of attack, they have a great disincentive to tell that to the United States, because if the United States bombs indiscriminately those villages in order to be able to get those terrorists, it is a massive loss of civilian life because there isn't actually a standard in check. There is no reason that those governments should trust the United States with that kind of information if their only responsibility is to protect the people within Pakistan, as is the Pakistan government's mandate. But moreover, I think this actually creates a narrative against terrorism within areas where they recruit terrorists. So what I mean by that is drones actually are considered largely to be a narrative by which anti-American sentiment is fostered within areas where drone strikes occur. What I mean by that is all sorts of terrorist organizations, particularly within Waziristan, can turn to civilians and say, you know who bombs you every day? The United States of America. And they bomb you because they don't want you to live. The reason why that narrative can be created is because there isn't an evidentiary standard in place. If the United States can say the reason why we bombed this particular facility is because we're going to get this particular guy because of this particular evidence standard, then that narrative can be more easily shifted. It actually allows a decruitment of terrorism within these areas. I'll take back half.
How does it make anyone feel any better to say, don't worry, our secret court, which has some standard for deciding when is this okay, said, we can kill you now, unless you're saying, oh, we're going to tell everyone about every decision we make it public.
Okay. Two responses. First of all, having an evidentiary standard is better than having none. So in the CIA being able to just say, oh, trust me, he was a militant, having actually a civilian body that determined by some evidence standard that he was a militant, probably better in terms of the public perception. But even secondly, in having a publicly listed death strike list, then I think governments and people around those areas can know that that was established in a preconceived way, instead of after the attack saying, trust me guys, they were all militants, it was all justified, with absolutely no other standard for having determined that. I think you get way more cooperation. But the last thing I want to say is that we should have a formal check on these strikes in principle. And I'll give you 3 reasons for that. First of all, because I think it's incumbent upon the person who holds the power of being able to create death in order to have some check on who they kill. What I mean by that is that an absolute person, a civilian inside Waziristan, has no ability to protect themselves from drone strike. They have no ability to tell the United States to not hit them, and they have no ability to provide any information in their defense. That's why it is incumbent upon the person who holds the weapon to be able to kill someone to be at least a little bit conservative and thoughtful in that process. But secondly, it undermines the whole message of preserving life that the United States tries to espouse within the developing world. If you are going to go on missions to be able to restructure governments so that they can better protect human lives, and if you're going to take an international standard that human life ought to be protected in every country, then you should at least have some sort of formal procedure that shows that you're also putting a check on lives of citizens that aren't your own, that you're not indiscriminately killing. And thirdly, it still hurts people in the United States to have some sort of indiscriminate policy. One of the reasons why we have this debate in the first place is because Anwar al-Awlaki's father, who was an American citizen, came to the court and said, you should provide some justification for why you killed my son in Yemen. To think that this is an isolated incident of people that don't matter at all to the United States public is completely wrong. And that's why we should have some sort of visual account for both the American people as well as the people being killed in these areas. Sure.
Can you give me a reason why indiscriminate attack which kills hundreds of civilians for someone who isn't a threat is something which would be wise for the US military to do, or something which the US military, given their current circumstances and current doctrines, would do?
So the problem with that is we have no idea that they're civilians, because it's the United States that gets to say 100 civilians were killed in this attack. Or they can say 100 people were killed in this attack and the majority we believe to be militants by no evidentiary standard as to who is a militant. We provide an evidentiary standard to be able to counter these narratives, because first government would just have you believe that we can trust the military or the CIA to be conservative in these attacks with no actual reason as to why they would be conservative. Okay, I'm going to go on to refutation. First of all, we get the idea like, look, these courts won't be good at it, they won't know what's necessary, bad methodology. 3 responses. First of all, I think that, I'm not first government, but I think it's probably that it's an evidence of guilt idea, where you provide documentation as to why this person poses a reasonable threat, and they're deciding if that is a reasonable threat. But secondly, if your whole job is to be on this court and decide these kind of evidence every day, I think much like a military professional, you get pretty good at it. In the sense that if this is actually your daily job and you've been informed of what the kind of calculuses are to be made, you know the kind of evidence standard, then you probably have a reasonable understanding of being able to make that decision. And thirdly, I assume all this information is probably entirely confidential and everyone is drafted. So what that means is that you can probably trust them with some risky intelligence in order to be able to make this decision, given the nature of that body. Secondly, they say, look, federal courts, it'll be really, really slow. 3 responses. First of all, I think that in order to have necessary information to prove someone's guilt, it has to be a little bit slow. But even then, you can probably have expedited trials for particular cases. But thirdly, I think you have a massive misperception of when drone strikes are used. Actually, people who commit drone strikes stalk their victims for like 3 weeks. They actually follow them to their homes, A, to gather intelligence about where they network, but also so they make sure that there are less civilians involved so that they know their daily routine. These drone strikes actually happen way, way slower, which is why you give the court enough time to be able to decide. Then they say formalized court action, it looks worse. My whole argument was about the the optics that it actually looks much, much worse to be able to drone strike every day, but have no accountability. But even then, the Obama administration clearly quadrupled its drone strike. So that way, if another president wants to remove it, we're totally fine with that too.
Thank you very much. Okay, op 3.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's very clear what is at the heart of this debate, and I think it's a couple of questions. First of all, are these courts capable of making these determinations and actually serving as a check? And second of all, do these courts make us better able to conduct counterterrorism and counterinsurgency operations in countries like Yemen and Pakistan? I want to answer this question by firstly adding a little bit of depth to the arguments that we've heard already about why these courts are not going to be capable of making these determinations and serving as an adequate check, specifically by expanding on the example of FISA courts that the United States already uses to justify warrantless wiretaps against its own population that have time and time again proved incapable of serving as an adequate check on the CIA and its will and its desire to use these types of coercive tactics against people who have no ability to have any sort of recourse. But finally, though, I want to actually expand on why this is going to be an even worse problem by explaining why we think that making a court the body that determines whether or not these strikes are legitimate removes the only internal checks that exist on the CIA, and as a result makes it far more likely that we have the types of indiscriminate attacks that kill dozens of civilians, create massive backlash, and endanger the United States in the international arena. But before I get to those points, a little bit of rebuttal from what we heard out of closing government. So what we just heard is two things primarily. First, we heard that using courts makes it easier to get terrorists because now other countries are going to be willing to cooperate with us. The argument is essentially this, that right now, when we just kill their civilians indiscriminately and have no sort of standard, no one wants to cooperate because the idea that the CIA said so is not enough. So, first of all, I would tell you, it's not the killing of the civilians that worries these people and makes them oppose drone strikes. Rather, it's that it endangers their political positions, that people like Zardari will be overthrown and lose political support if people in their countries believe the United States is violating their sovereignty, and so as a result, as Harish told us, are forced to take a position against them. So, what's the problem? Now, on their side of the house, perhaps there's a standard, but the fact that the government has explicitly and openly endorsed this praxis makes it far more likely that people like Zardari need to take a strong stance against this, and do the exact types of things that they've done in response already to a greater extent. Things like funding madrasas to placate radical populations in Western Pakistan, or things like refusing to use the Pakistani military to back up the United States in these types of drone operations, making it more difficult for us to operate on the ground and actually get the people who are causing us problems. But also, I just don't buy the argument that having a court is going to solve the problem of people not thinking, trust us, the CIA said so is enough. Now it's, trust us, the CIA told us in court. I don't think this makes a meaningful difference to anyone who's concerned about this not being legitimate. But the second thing we heard, though, is that in principle, we need a check. And essentially the argument is this, that look, we need a procedure in order for this to work, and we need a procedure to prove that we're not doing this indiscriminately. First of all, as we've heard all the way down off benches, it's not as if the CIA has no internal standards for this. In fact, the CIA has an internal check. And that check, which I don't think has been adequately discussed, is that people like CIA directors actually get massive public backlash when they do things like bomb weddings in Pakistan. That's why they've stopped doing so. These types of internal checks exist, and I'm going to talk later about why we think on their side of the house they get rid of these checks entirely. I'll take front.
Don't you think there's going to be a better perception of these drone strikes if there is an open court process where it can be explained exactly why it is the sovereignty is being breached?
Whoa. If it's an open court process, now you have to discuss sensitive information like Backhalf just told us in an open and transparent way. So if it's an open court process, now suddenly the militants know we're thinking about attacking them, so that's certainly not going to work. But if it's not an open court process, which we think is far more likely, now it's a secret court process. So now you're saying we had a secret court that said it was okay for us to bomb you. That also doesn't improve our perception. That doesn't solve any of these problems. It's just saying, now what the CIA does in secret, a court does in secret. That's not meaningful change. So, let's move on to our constructive argumentation. I want to talk first in more detail about why we think courts are incapable of making these determinations. As we've already heard from opening, courts are incapable of making these types of judgments. Because the question of whether or not there are a lot of civilians around, or whether this person is in fact a high-value target, are questions that no judge is capable of determining because judges are not military experts or experts on Al-Qaeda. What's going to happen, as we've already heard, is is that the military is going to get up and say, trust us, we figured it out, and the court is going to check the box. Now, what we heard in response to this were a couple of things. First, we heard from opening, no, a witness process is going to solve this because you're going to have witnesses who say the opposite and it'll work just like every other court. First of all, who are these opposing witnesses? The military comes forward and says, we have this data. No one else has it, so no one else can say, no, this actually isn't necessary. The court process won't work. But second of all, if that's true, this would prove the argument that we heard from opening opposition, that this is going to take a massive amount of time if you need to have an evidentiary process with witnesses coming forward over time. That means that if you have someone who is, say, in a location for a limited amount of time, it's impossible to actually approve that strike, because if they move, whatever was approved, for example, when they were in Abbottabad, suddenly is no longer approved if they move to somewhere else. So no, over time this doesn't work. But also we think, and this is the constructive material I want to add to this point, that the empirical example of FISA courts actually proves that this works in the way that we believe on our side of the House. FISA courts are used for the United States government to decide whether or not it is constitutional and whether or not it is necessary to use a warrantless wiretap to monitor people in our country. Here's the problem. The way these courts actually work in practice is that the CIA comes forward and says, we need to do this, we need to monitor this person. Now in the most open cases, if the CIA says, here's why, and the court says, well, we're not capable of making this determination, here's your warrant, which is why FISA courts have an over 90% approval rate. But even worse is when the CIA says, we need to monitor a person. We can't tell you who they are, we can't tell you why, but what we can tell you is that it's a massive threat to national security. We believe those cases are even worse and prevent any sort of adequate checks. That's why we believe, on their side of the House, they get more of the worst types of strikes. They get more of the indiscriminate killing and more of the backlash. No thank you. The last and final thing I want to talk about, though, which I think is the debate-winning argument, is why on their side of the House they remove the only actual check that exists. If courts can't serve as a check because they can't make this determination, and they rubber stamp every case that comes before them, this is even worse than the status quo. Because now we believe that CIA officials are accountable to the public, that when the public is able to say the director of the CIA authorized these strikes that killed dozens or hundreds of civilians, they look very bad, which is why they stopped doing the types of attacks that we already heard from opening opposition they stopped in the mid-2000s. Here's the problem, though. On their side of the House, the CIA always has incentive to bring these cases to the court, because it's always in their interest to try to conduct the strike. Here's the problem, though. They're never accountable for the backlash, because now the CIA can always say it was the court. The court said it was fine. So now the CIA has no incentive to check internally. Now every strike gets put forward because now the CIA has no reason to stop it internally, and now the courts are completely incapable of actually stopping these strikes because they're not capable of making these decisions, and because they always rubber stamp these types of proposals empirically because they defer to the military and to the CIA. This is a problem. It means on their side of the House, the only check that exists in the status quo is gone. So you have more indiscriminate strikes, you have more civilian casualties, and more backlash, and fewer options for recourse. These are the reasons why we think we should not have a court. We're extremely proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. Okay, prop 4.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think the problem with the extension that we just got from opposition was that it refused to engage with the comparative that Sarah outlined for you in her extension. Yeah, sure, it's a bummer if FISA courts have like a very high rate of conviction or of agreeing with the recommendation by the CIA, but we would still tell you that in those certain cases where they do stand up and they do disagree with the recommendation by the court, that is better than a world where there is absolutely no oversight. We would say even if the benefit ends up being marginal, there's all sorts of other benefits that we brought to you in extension that went largely unaddressed by opposition. We think that that's hugely problematic. So I'm going to bring two questions to summarize this round. The first thing I want to talk about is in a world where both sides of this debate have conceded that drone strikes are a necessity of modern warfare, how does a formalized approval process impact international attitudes towards the United States? I think that that's like one of the larger issues that have run through this debate. And then I'm going to get to the second question about like what the actual impact on the process of drone strikes is a little bit later. So let's get to this first question, where it's how does this impact the optics? So I think that we're talking about two different kinds of areas, and I think that they've been a little bit conflated by both op benches. So I think that we're talking first about Pakistan, the state actor, right, and like the obligations that the particular state has to its citizens and the way that it interacts with the United States abroad. But I also think that we're talking about these non-state, non-sovereign areas where the people that live there don't have a relationship to the government of Pakistan, and that's why we use drones to go after them, because we can't collaborate with Pakistan, and Pakistan has no sovereignty over that area. So I'm going to deal with these two separate cases. First, in the case of areas of Pakistan where Pakistan does want to assert some kind of sovereignty, or does have claims or pretensions to sovereignty over that area, I would tell you that in cases where the government needs to protect itself, it ends up being unable to collaborate with the US in cases where it looks like the United States is actively subverting its authority. At the point where opposition, both sides of opposition have said that we're not going to stop the drone strikes. The drone strikes are going to continue regardless of whether or not there is a formal process of oversight. I think that this animosity and the suspicion towards the United States continues to exist, but without any access to justice or recourse for when those situations go wrong. I think that is massively problematic, and that giving people access to this justice is an important thing that the United States can do. I also think that the characterization of drone strikes that we got from first opposition was hugely problematic when they talked about how this was regularizing drone strikes. When Sarah points out to you an extension is that drone strikes are already a regular feature of life in these non-state areas, right? Like, it's not really a dramatic shift at the point where there's now a formalized process that you can appeal to, right? I actually think it gives people more access to justice and more recourse. But the other thing I want to talk about is what it does, what these evidentiary standards are when we're identifying these kinds of combatants. So I actually think that under the status quo, we agree. The United States isn't going after wedding parties anymore. That doesn't happen with the same amount of frequency. But what the United States is able to do in a world where you're not able to, or you're not forced to produce evidentiary standards, is that you can claim that any young man between the ages of 18 and 22 that was killed as collateral in a drone strike was a non-enemy combatant, right? Because that's just the assumption of young men who live in those particular areas of the world. I think that that is a hugely problematic stance for the government, to take. And I think that the fact that those deaths go largely unexplained, just as a result of those young men's gender and their age and the place that they live, is a massive problem, a PR problem for the United States. I think Sarah points out to you that that increases the likelihood that the recruiting for terrorism will increase in those areas. I think that is a huge problem. I'll take opening.
Okay. So the problem that people in Pakistan have with drone strikes is their citizens are being killed, their sovereignty is overridden, and their reminds against international law. Can you give me a plausible reason why they will really care that a US court, which they probably don't really trust, says that it's okay to do?
Okay, yeah, because I do think that the United States court will have to make some kind of distinctions between killings that were justified and killings that were not. And in the cases where those killings weren't justified, I actually think you have better access to justice and better access to recourse and a stronger claim against the United States government than a world where just because the CIA said so. I actually think that that is a hugely evil and dangerous world to live in. So, that's dealing with the areas where Pakistan has sovereignty and where these sovereignty claims matter. Like the state of Pakistan, how does this impact the state of Pakistan? In those volatile regions, do we really think that a formalized process makes anti-American sentiment worse? I actually don't know that that gets substantially worse on their side of the house. I think that anti-American sentiment is pretty rampant in those parts of the world. I don't think that this is going to be the thing that broke the camel's back. I think at the point at which you're a terrorist, you're engaged in you're not affiliated with a particular state, you want to take up arms against the great Satan. The courts are not the thing that's going to do it for you. That's not going to be the litmus test for you. I actually don't think that you're changing hearts and minds in those particular parts of the world. So I think that that conception is hugely problematic. So let's move on to this second question, where it's how does this formalized process, no thank you, shift the process of these strikes and what the actual impact of these strikes are. So this is, I think, what Sarah brings to you in extension when she talks to you about the comparative between a world with the CIA just unilaterally making these decisions and a world where the courts are attempting to establish some kind of evidentiary standards. And just so we're all clear on the confidentiality thing, my understanding, and I followed this bench fairly closely, was that the death lists would be public, but that it's possible that for security reasons you need to keep the evidence that leads you to create that list private, right, confidential, that you don't undermine the security of those areas. So death lists are public, but the evidence probably not going to leave the courtroom. I don't actually think that that's hugely problematic or really worth contesting at this late point in the round. Okay. So, the difference between the CIA and the court is that the court has an incentive to protect human rights and to protect claims of rights because that's what courts do. The CIA has an incentive to protect American lives at all costs. That is a hugely problematic framework from which to assess the legitimacy of a drone strike. No, thank you. I think at the point at which the CIA is allowed to make determinations about the legitimacy of the drone strike, because their accountability and their responsibility is to protecting American lives, it's unlikely that they are going to want to err on the side of caution. It is, of course, that they are going to authorize more drone strikes in an effort to fulfill their mandate. that's distinct from the mandate of courts, which are meant to evaluate human rights in the comparative. So I actually think you get much better rights protections in a world where the courts is involved. Under the status quo, the United States is not meant to produce evidence or indicate the kinds of guilt that are associated with these drone strikes. I think I've already talked about why this is particularly problematic for young men that live in these regions. Sarah talked to you about why that's particularly problematic in terms of recruiting the terrorist groups. I also want to get back to this last point of Sarah's extension before I close up this speech. Sarah talks to you about governments wanting to collaborate, potentially collaborate with the United States. I think that this was like a little bit mischaracterized by the opposition extension speaker. Yes, it is unlikely that like Pakistan and the United States are going to enter into some like warm, fuzzy, like open alliance. But I do think that it reduces any incentive for Pakistan to pass information to the United States government, as has happened in the past, right? Like where these governments collaborate. I do think that we want a world where there is a free exchange of information, creating more security for both parties. For all those reasons, we're very proud of this.
Thank you very much. Up for.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to look at two important areas in this debate because I think they both pretty clearly demonstrate why the establishment of a court may be something that sounds appealing, but in reality actually is a devastating approach. So what are those two areas? The first is, what is the effect of going public when the United States decides we have an internal system where this is our plan and this is what we're going to do? And the second is, what does the court actually look like and how does it impact our ability to deal with counterterrorism? So, let's deal with this first question. What is the effect of going public? Because we get this sort of bizarre, somewhat rosy picture that says that if we end up having these courts, we'll establish lots of collaboration and evidence so that people will be happy and no one will be angry at the United States anymore. This makes no sense, right? Because why are countries not collaborating? It isn't because they're not really sure if the United States wants to be striking them or not. It's because they have their own internal laws that say we are not okay with these violations of sovereignty. Or they have some kind of under-the-table agreement when it comes to situations like Pakistan in which they sort of understand it's going to happen, but don't accept it publicly. There is literally no reason why, if the United States says, no, we have a formal procedure for allowing us to strike you, that any of those places are going to be more likely to collaborate in any way whatsoever. Which means the argument sort of morphs into like, well, there are evidentiary standards and people will be happy that there are these standards. Let's be very clear about the kinds of standards that these courts have, right? The only analogies we have are things like the FISA courts, and they're things like, we have probable cause to believe that you are an enemy and combatant who poses a threat to someone else. What kind of evidentiary standard is that from the point of view of individual competence? It only matters if you believe that those courts are actually competently able to make determinations about who falls on either side, which is contingent on your belief of legitimacy of the individual people in the court, not just the idea that says there is a line which establishes our evidentiary standard from one point or another. That simply doesn't make sense as a means of actually building international competence. Yes?
Do you think that the military is more or less likely to strike a small village in Yemen that they know nothing about, when they have no parameters and no pre-consideration of that decision, or when they make a considered decision with parameters of what is acceptable level of collateral damage?
I think it is a question that does not actually relate to the debate that we're having today, because the reality is that the military does have internal standards about what it is and isn't allowed to do, and the reason why it has those standards is because it worries about public backlash. But the danger is that if you ultimately allow them to pass it on to the court, that means it can pass the buck and say, hey, the courts are the ones who are going to deal with this, we don't need to take individual responsibility, they absolve themselves of that responsibility, wash their hands. That's the argument that Josh made an extension that we hear no substantive response to, on the second half of the Gov or in the POI, which seems to misunderstand that point. So let's get back to the question of going public. The reality is that you're no more likely to have anyone be willing to collaborate, and you're no more likely to build confidence in any individual because you abstractly claim that you have some kind of evidentiary standard. In reality, the system actually operates in the reverse. That is to say that you publicly and more legitimately say it is our interest to go after you and attack you in those cases, and other nations feel more emboldened because they're able to say, look, the United States has legitimized themselves, and they're able to return that into propaganda even more. So there seems to be no legitimate reason why anyone else would look at this and say, well, like, now we're all safe because the United States, which doesn't follow laws and bombs us, now has fake laws that they cannot follow and bomb us. That doesn't make sense. So, that's the second question, and the even more important question here, which is, what do these courts end up looking like? What is the reality of the number of cases in which they actually allow drone strikes, right? And this is very fuzzy throughout the debate, and so I want to paint two different pictures of the ways that these courts could work and explain why both of them actually are incredibly detrimental. The first and far more likely one is the one that Josh explains. That is to say that these courts are ones that just constantly rubber stamp any decision where someone says they want to come up. This means they approve over 90% of the cases. This is exactly what happens in the FISA courts. Why is it true? Because any judge is worried to say, well, hey, I'm not a national security expert, I didn't grow up in this, I'm certainly not a member of the military, otherwise it wouldn't be a legitimate court in the way they explain it, therefore I'm not in a position to be able to say no to the military, and I don't want the blood on my hands of making that decision, which means they rubber stamp them. Yes, they ignore some 9 or 10% of cases in which they say, hey, this doesn't follow legitimate standards. The problem is, there's no reason why they made a good determination in those 9 or 10% of cases, because they're not trained to make these actual decisions. So they say, hey, it's better because we get rid of like 10%. But not if you randomly get rid of 10%, and those aren't actually the bad drone strikes. Our argument on side up is that these judges are in no position to make those determinations, which makes it far more likely you get random decisions and fail to go after people you actually necessarily need to go after in drone strikes. So, the reality is that you get almost indiscriminate rubber stamping left and right. But what also happens? You massively increase the number of cases that go to these courts because you embolden the CIA to say, hey, we no longer are accountable, we can always blame the courts for these things happening, we pass the buck along in that case, which means they far likely to spend many, many more cases, 90% of which get approved, and then you get lots and lots of terrible cases, the kinds of ones you actually don't approve of. Yes, I'll take that.
Your only argument as to why the CIA would be more conservative is it looks bad if they kill civilians. But why should the only metric for when we kill civilians be on a PR standpoint instead of a rights standpoint?
My argument isn't that's the only metric. I'm saying this is a convenient and very nice internal check, which means the CIA is very, very careful about the decisions they make. I also believe they have other standards, like they say, we're not going to indeterminately kill civilians. But the reasons why they follow those standards so religiously is because they're worried about the public outcome. Yes, it may be like not an ideal motivation, but it gets excellent results. That's to say, over the last 5 or 10 years, we've gotten far, far better at the kinds of cases we actually go, the number of people we strike. The problem is you get rid of all those standards whatsoever because people are able to say, hey, the courts are doing it. So what do you get? You get far more cases and you get secret trampling of the law in which all you're able to say is like, hey, no, we made the decisions internally, it met some standard of what is legal without legitimately getting rid of that. Or, what's the other alternative? That we think that's much more likely, and that's what we explain specifically in the extension. But we sort of get the argument coming out of opening opposition that this may be very slow and actually hindering. And we think this is a reasonable possibility as well. Now, we deal with both these contingencies because it's very unclear as to the extent to which, like, they'll bring up expert witnesses and take a very long time, or they won't bring up expert witnesses and won't take a very long time. In those cases, if you're actually going to say, we want the courts to operate independently and really look at this stuff extraordinarily carefully, it is simply going to take forever. It's going to take forever because you need to be able to call expert witnesses, because you need to be able to look through all the individual evidence and try to make your own individual determinations, so you aren't just saying to the military, yes, whatever you claim is okay, that's perfectly fine. In those cases, you often lose the opportunity, because we get this picture painted by the back half that says like, hey, we're following these people for several weeks, so you just know when to pull the trigger or not. That makes no sense because you only can get approval to pull the trigger in a context-specific situation. That is to say, of a given person in a given place. You can't just say you're allowed to kill this person because they walk into the middle of a public place, you no longer have authority. Which means, in fact, probably these are instantaneous decisions in which you lose the time to make the attack, or you just rubber stamp them and get no meaningful advantage over everything whatsoever. It sounds nice to say abstractly, we want to have internal checks because we want to say we're responsible of ourselves internally. The reality is that these mechanisms are actually completely defeatist when it comes to those approaches. You either rubber stamp and let everything go, or you don't rubber stamp and then you just don't get anyone, which is what both of us want to do.